fueling my training. And so that's been an epiphany for me really in the last couple weeks. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir about this, but it truly has been such a game changer for me in so many ways. To quote Finding Nemo, I was like Bruce the shark. I was a mindless eating machine. And now I'm just like, I get done and I'm not even that hungry for a snack, but I do it just to put a few calories and a little bit of protein in afterwards. Then I'm fine. It's like how I feel in the evening is so much more intuitive now. I'm not like, I'm starving, I got to eat something. I'm starving, I got to eat something. It feels very different.
And when
It's
you're in that
honestly,
state of,
it's changed everything.
oh, I'm glad. Yeah, makes me very happy. Like this, it makes me happy hearing people like experience this, because this is what I see and I know where people get it and they put it into practice. And it's not about perfection, but it's when you make these little changes that we can write off like it doesn't make a difference. Like honestly, it does make a difference.
Mhm.
Do you want to explain a little bit like who you are, what you do as a coach and a cyclist yourself?
Sure, happy to do that. My name is Josh, and I am actually a retired, not from being a professional, not that old yet, retired mid-pack half marathoner. So I did that
Yeah.
for about 8 or 10 years, and my hips and back just couldn't take it anymore. And I love long distance. I love endurance. I love the feeling you get from training and all the tactical elements that go into planning an event like a half marathon or a marathon. And when I got to the point where my back and hips couldn't take it anymore, I just, I was like, all right, I love this side of sport too much. I'm going to take up cycling. And it
Yeah.
truly was the best thing I ever did. I can train more often because it doesn't put your hips into extension. It's low impact. And I fell in love with it. And I'm fortunate. I have a background. My Bachelor of Science is in kinesiology. I have been a prep school and high school cross country coach in addition to my own running background. And so the switch to cycling was both in some ways seamless. And at the same time, I made so many of the mistakes that so many other cyclists who are new to the sport make.
Yeah.
And the more I
Part of
got
the
into it,
process almost, isn't it?
it really is. It's like there's no way out but through. You have to make some of those mistakes. It's part of the journey. And as I was doing that, I just, for me at my age, it was becoming a cycling coach, having already done a couple of events and built up to the World Ultra Cycle Association 12 hour, which I did a lot of things well and I did a lot of things wrong. I really had a passion for specifically the endurance cycling piece of it and really helping other cyclists because it's easy when you have the knowledge base. It's not arrogance at all. It's just you forget and take for granted sometimes the background you have in that, and really
Yeah.
have a passion for helping others enjoy the training, enjoy the journey, and be able to, whatever their individual aspirations are, enjoy the act of doing an event, whatever it might be, whether it's their first century, their first metric, London to Brighton, which is a little shorter, or something even more of a longer length. And so I set about, I got my USA Cycling coaching license, and I've had the wonderful opportunity to train a number of different athletes, both on this continent and in Europe.
Yeah.
And it is just, as you know, it's just so rewarding to watch people be successful and know that you played a small part in creating the conditions for their success. So
Oh,
I enjoy it
absolutely.
thoroughly. I've sort
Yeah.
of gotten into a whole different number of irons in the fire. I'm wearing my Stolen Goat t-shirt here today. So I partnered with them, and now I'm suddenly
Yeah.
their director of U.S. operations on
Oh,
the ground
wow.
in the United States. So I sort
Yeah.
of wear as a badge of honor being a kind of a cyclopreneur, if nothing else. And just I have such a passion for the sport. It's neat. Our daughter is a intercollegiate triathlete and competes in
Yeah.
the NCAA here in the United States. And I'm never going to be a swimmer. I swim like a sunken canoe. But it's nice that we share the cycling aspect of it, and so we
Yeah.
watch the Tour de France. We watch the Tour de France Femme. It's just become a very family-oriented activity for us too. So cycling has brought just so many gifts in both my life and our family's lives.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think that joy and enjoying the sport, whether you're competitive or not, I think is so important, because then I think a lot of times people view exercise as punishment and this
Yeah.
horrible thing. Whereas if you, there's so many different sports and activities out there, and if you find the thing that gives you that dopamine hit, that gives you that joy, you're so much more likely to stick with it in the long term. And going back to the coaching element, I think for me as a sports dietitian, whenever people are like, oh, what should I eat? For me, it always comes back to the training. What does your training look like? And
Yeah.
I've certainly directed a lot of my clients to coaches to get support, because I've seen that sort of very like either doing too much or doing too little approach with their training. And when you get that specificity and you get a clear structure, you can get really far. And then the nutrition is then supported around that. So I wonder, like, if you had, or like what are the common mistakes that you see from a coaching perspective that a lot of athletes are making?
Well, I can sort of talk about that in a number of different ways, both from the exercise physiology standpoint, and then I can share my own journey because I've
Yeah,
made probably every nutritional mistake in the book, and
yeah.
I'm more than
I think we
happy.
all have.
Of course, and I'm happy
Yeah.
to share that piece of it because if people can learn and preempt their own mistakes from my mistakes, that's me helping other people enjoy the process more.
100%.
I think the big thing, and again, I know my lane. I am very passionate and enjoy and feel very competent and confident in helping cyclists grow their capabilities as an endurance rider, whether that's again for a metric century, a full century, double century, long distance, London to Paris, climbing, all those things I feel are my wheelhouse. And I know my lane. Like I'm not, if somebody needs a coach who's going to help them become a crit racer or a very short time trialist, I'm going to help refer them to somebody else because that's not my thing.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the endurance piece of it, I think one thing that we as a coaching body understand, but we also don't package it from a motivation or a sales standpoint,
Mm.
is we talk about, base building and endurance, and you've got to build a base and this, that, or the other thing in zone two. There's an element of repetitiveness to that takes time and patience to build,
Yeah.
but we don't do a good a job as we can of making a compelling argument for
Mm.
truly why that is so important and how
Mm.
that's going to apply to a cyclist and their success in completing an event and then enjoying
Mm.
it more. And honestly, if they have aspirations of a particular time or whatever, of being able to accomplish that. So I think the biggest thing is helping cyclists understand what you're actually doing to your body and why it matters. So I don't talk a
Mm.
lot in terms of the base or just zone two. I talk a lot about it in making a distinction between how you use your fast twitch fibers
Yeah.
and how you use your slow twitch fibers,
Mm.
and boiling that down to an understandable level. So a passionate cyclist who is, has experience, understands the bike, understands indoor training. They could be an expert in so many ways as a cyclist, bike handling, you
Yeah.
name it. But if they don't have that foundational knowledge to be able to give them that piece of it, where when you're using those fast twitch fibers, you are torching your glycogen, it's going out the door.
Yeah.
And in order to keep going, you have to have highly developed slow twitch fibers. And yes, we can get into mitochondria and all of it on a
Mm.
cellular level, but understand that when you burn, and I'm speaking to the choir when I say this, when you burn that glycogen and you use your fast twitch fibers, you are creating lactic acid, that lactate, and that's used as a minor source of fuel. And then it has to be cleared in order to remain efficient. The nutrition piece fits right into that as a neat piece of the puzzle, as you know better than anybody.
Yeah.
But I talk about that training at that zone 2 level from become a lactate clearing machine. Can you
Mm.
teach yourself and can you train your body and your slow twitch fibers to clear lactate? And to
Yeah.
me, and maybe I'm just a science nerd, to me, that just comes across as much more compelling of
Yeah.
why I'm doing this training at an intensity level that maybe doesn't feel like I feel after I do a high intensity session. And
Yeah.
it's that bulk of training at that lower intensity that's going to allow for you to be really efficient over the long distance. And without
Yeah.
it, it's just not as enjoyable, as efficient, or as successful. So I
Oh,
think
definitely.
that's one of the biggest mistakes I see is a lack of sort of passion and understanding around that component of training. And
Mm.
then it's understandable where folks are like kind of look at it from like a bench press standpoint where they're like, well, I can bench press 50 pounds. Why do I have to do this anymore? You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? And strength training is very different. Yes, in
Yeah.
strength training, you're probably gonna, bump that weight up and keep going. But until you got to just keep repeatedly training that zone, both from a
Mm.
watt standpoint and from a heart rate and from a metabolic standpoint in order
Yeah.
to get better. And it's just something that doesn't happen overnight. There really is a trust the process element to it.
I find nutrition definitely being the same because typically find people not fueling or fueling, they think a lot, but actually it's minuscule in the grand scheme of things. And and when you're doing this high intensity effort, even if it's short duration, especially on Zwift, you're doing indoor training, I've seen a big increase in energy expenditure. You're going at a higher, like what's higher, like the higher the intensity, the more carbohydrate you're burning. And if you're not fueling that with what you're eating during that session, it is like just churning through glycogen sessions. And I've been a research participant in a lot of different studies where we've done the glycogen. I've got the scars to prove it with the muscle biopsies, and I've completely annihilated my glycogen stores with a minute and a half worth of work. I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't stand up. I was a 30-second wind gate tests and 5 minutes gap in between
Yep.
3 wind gates. I could not for the life of me stand up for an hour afterwards because every time I stood up, I'd start seeing stars and I'd be like right back down on the floor again. And yeah, that's certainly something I've seen. People don't realize just how energetically demanding some of these sessions can be, which they might be short and intense, or they might be long and constant. And once your glycogen stores are out, like you can keep going, but that's when you're kind of crawling steady, no capacity. Like, I don't know, like my power just went off a cliff. I was like, yeah, I don't think it's fueling. I'm like, it's definitely fueling, but the training links into that too.
It does. And those things just go so hand in hand. And as I mentioned before, I'm like a case study in all of those mistakes. And I can still remember back pretty early in my cycling days, I
Mm,
had gone out and this was, I both obviously had the exercise physiology piece of it and that foundation. And I've
mm,
always prided myself on the hydration piece of it, both as it relates to, both pure water consumption and electrolytes and all of those other things. And had this very sort of antiquated old school notion
mm.
around sports nutrition
Yeah.
that really bit me very quickly. So I had gone out. This was years ago, and this was during this summer, and it was warm. It wasn't that hot, and I had done a metric century. I'd done 63-ish miles, and it is as hard as I've ever bonked. Like I was in bad shape. Like
Yeah.
on that pivot point because I didn't understand what was going on. I
Yeah.
basically I boiled it down to well, I'm new enough in cycling. Maybe I just didn't drink as much as I thought. Maybe the heat was worse than I thought it was. And all I was doing was that old school, well, I did a mostly zone 2 ride and you're burning mostly fat or this, that, or the other thing. And because it was that, I don't have to worry about just, a little bit of food here and there. So I don't completely bonk. And clearly it was so nowhere near the amount of calories and carbohydrates I needed, it's as close as I've come to like saying to my wife, you gotta take me to like the emergency room. And it never quite got that bad,
Wow.
thankfully.
Yeah.
But I was in a bad state. And looking back on it in retrospect, I had blamed it on the heat. But I can see now and thinking back, because I'm putting cold water over my head, I'm putting water on my wrists, and of course that's going to help a little bit. I'm bringing my core
Mm.
temperature down, but it was the Gatorade and far too many tortilla chips that finally got me to a place where I was like, okay, I don't feel like I'm dying right now.
Yeah.
And so that was my first experience with that. But I still, again, I didn't know enough and I
Mm.
chalked it up to the heat. And then the second time was when I did the World Ultra Cycling Association 12 hour.
Yeah.
There was a moment where I got a little carried away and had been watching too much of the Giro d'Italia and it's a draft legal event. So I'd been drafting for 40 miles and I hadn't burned any energy. And then, you come in for your first break and all of a sudden, the pack splits up and I'm like, I saw five guys in the distance. And so, of course, my ego got the best of me and I'm like, bridging up to them and whatnot.
Yeah.
And um, that was only a small part of it when I look back on it now. Again, I was in that place of, well, I need to take in calories, but because it was really hot, I was almost over focused on fluid consumption. And I know
Yeah.
enough, not to do the
Yeah.
hyponatremia thing, and everything I had was an electrolyte beverage, but I hit the wall after, the race started at 8 in the morning. It was right around 5 p.m. And I thought I was done. And I'm like, all right, the heat got to me. It's the heat again, everything else. And then I was like, well, I'm going to give it 20 minutes. Let's see what happens. And, if I had been in heat exhaustion or heat stroke, obviously I'm not recovering in 20 minutes, but I had
No.
a rest. I had some Gatorade. I had some food. And all of a
You
sudden I'm
perked up.
okay again. Right.
Yeah.
It's a miracle. I feel better now.
Yeah.
And so I
But
went back
to do
out.
that, you literally have to stop. Like you
Yes,
can't. It's
I
it's
did.
not like it's like refueling a car. You can't
Yeah.
like plug it in and then keep
No,
driving. You got to
no, it's not
physically
like an
stop
in-air,
it.
it's not like midair like the Air Force where the planes are fueling each other.
Yeah.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
stopped. I felt better. And I wasn't obviously, again, the watts had fallen off the cliff at that point because I had
Yeah.
obviously put myself in that deficit. And so I finished. And the way it works in the 12 hour at this event is in order to get credit for anything you've done up to 8 p.m., you have to finish the last lap. So obviously, like
Yeah.
I'm probably sometimes too competitive for my own good, but I was like, all right, I'm skipping my fueling stop on the last lap because,
Yeah.
and again, you pay for it now,
I
you
don't
pay
need
for
it.
it later. I cross the
Yeah.
finish line. I'm like, yay. And 10 minutes later, I actually still have a 10-second video of ice bags on my quads, and my quads are going like this, and I'm doubled over again. But again, I chalked it up to the heat because it
Yeah.
was 93 that day. But I was so well hydrated. In retrospect, it had nothing to do with the heat. I took
Yeah.
care of that piece of it. I clothed properly. I had the ice socks on the back of my neck. It was all nutrition. And it still
Mm.
took me another year and a half of learning from you and understanding the modern science around it until I get it now.
Yeah.
And even in the interim, I built up. I eat more now. But really, honestly, it's been until like this last magical 10 days where really the light has finally come on for me,
Yeah.
and I'm
Well,
finally
this is the
reaping the
thing that I
benefits of it.
find it takes. I find that even when I'm working with clients, like typically with my one-on-one clients, it'll be about 3 months I'll be working with them. And I'll be like, okay, I want you to eat this amount. And I've seen time and time again, it'll take them 10 days before they like, oh, okay, maybe I'll give it a go. And it's, yeah, I think the psychology of like, oh, I don't need it, and
Mhm.
rewriting that thought and
Yeah.
understanding, like, because a lot of times people know what to do, like, or they know the theory
Yeah.
of what to do, but then they brush it off, or oh, it doesn't really make a difference. And that's why I always like getting people to write it down and test it out. Because I'm like, well,
Yeah.
don't take my word for it. Like, I'm
Yeah.
going to keep telling you this is what you need, but it's when you feel it for
Yeah.
yourself. And I find what I saw in my research and my practice is that typically it'll take people 3 years of mistakes and their races falling apart, or
Mhm.
just not quite performing the way they want to, before they're like, okay, maybe something's going on here. And then they're willing to give it a try. And yeah, similar, like you were saying, I want to help to leapfrog those mistakes and like learn from these mistakes, learn from our mistakes, because again, we're not perfect. We will continue to make mistakes because there's always different environments or different situations
Mhm.
that will affect us. But when you see the light and you physically feel and see the impact on your performance, you don't see your power, your what's falling off a cliff. You keep that energy going constant. You're not like ravenously hungry after the end of a ride. Like all these things, when you start to feel like, that's different, interesting. This feels a bit easier. This feels like manageable. I could keep
Yeah.
going on this.
And that's literally what I've gone through in the past couple weeks. I finally got
Yeah.
to the point where, again, I've done better recently, and I certainly did better in the event that I did back in June that I had done at the 12 hour, which is a couple years ago now. So, and I literally remember, so I did better, but in retrospect, it wasn't quite up to the standard it needed to be.
Mm.
Where the pivotal moment for me was at the aid station at mile 90, where I ate the best baked potato I've ever eaten in my entire life. And it was there by happenstance. And I'm really glad it was, because it
Yeah.
allowed me to finish feeling much better about myself. Where
Mm.
somebody from another aid station, which was further back, and so they'd been closed up for the day, and arrived, and this woman, just like a gift, was like, I have some leftover baked potatoes. Do you want one? We've kept it in a a warm cooler all day. And I'm like, yes, please. And it was
Mm.
just, I unpeeled it with the tinfoil and I ate it like a banana. Like that's how good it was. And that's how silly I looked at the aid station. But I give that baked potato
Yeah.
all the credit in the world from getting me from mile 90 to mile 125. And I had some other stuff along the way,
Yeah.
but that potato made the difference for me. So I stayed at that level of,
Mm.
all right, I intuitively know on event day I need more, but I still wasn't really good about, well, what am I going to do during training
Yeah.
that's ultimately going to have that effect? And like you said, it's like it just takes the human psychology
Mm.
sometimes a long time to be willing to experiment or to do it. And
Yeah.
I said to myself, all right, I'm a cycling coach, and I'm asking people to trust the science around lactate clearing and why this is so important. And if I put a program together for somebody, whether it's I'm working directly with them one-on-one, or they're uploading a program that I provide for them that's going to be, multi weeks, 12, 16 weeks, and you're seeing a certain large percentage of this in what somebody might determine a boring ride. If I'm
Yeah.
asking them to trust that science and passionate about explaining the why, I need to get over my own hurdle with this and
Mm.
really start fueling my training. And so that's been an epiphany for me really in the last couple weeks. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir about this, but it truly has been such a game changer for me in so many ways. I had done a really high intensity effort that I smashed through a plateau that I've honestly been stuck at for a
Yeah.
really long time. And these are, we talk awful lot. It's like, oh, marginal gains in cycling, marginal gains in cycling, but
Yeah.
sometimes we're not willing to try something new that will help you with a marginal gain. And it
Honestly,
was
with
amazing.
nutrition, I'm like, it is such a big performance enhancer. Why
Yeah,
do people like a natural legal? It's legal, it's real, and it has
I
such a
know.
big impact. Like it can take such a huge amount of time off your distance and your speed if you
Yes.
haven't got the right fueling in place.
Yes. And I think, and I'm not someone who is at all interested in anything related to weight loss. But at
Yeah,
the same time, I come with the same biases
mm,
from decades. Well, this is where you're going to create your calorie deficit. So,
yeah,
well, it would be taboo to be eating during this period of time because that's going to undermine everything you're doing. And if
yeah,
I'm honest with myself and I'm honest with you, even
mm,
though again it's never been about weight loss, but it is about weight maintenance. I'm like, well, I'm not going to risk that. Why would I be taking in all of these calories
yeah,
when I feel like I shouldn't be taking those calories in while I'm exercising? And again, that notion of, all right, I'm asking people to trust me. It's time that I trust the folks like you who are
mm,
passionate and so knowledgeable about your science. So I'm just like, all right, I'm doing it. And not only did it make a massive, like you said, performance enhancement impact in that ride, I've never felt so good the next day.
yeah,
And I stick to my training's very polarized. So massive amounts of it are zone 2. I'm like, nope, I'm not just gonna stuff myself during a zone 2 ride, but I'm taking in way
mm,
more calories than I used to in an hour and
mm,
45, 2 hour sort of endurance, slow twitch fiber training session. And you mentioned the whole hunger thing. That's been the
mm,
biggest change for me.
yeah,
I used to be not only starving when I got off the bike,
yeah,
but it would just continue all day. I was
yeah,
just, to quote Finding Nemo, I was like Bruce the shark. I was a
yeah,
mindless eating machine. And now I'm just like, I get done and
yeah,
I'm not even that hungry for a snack, but I do
yeah,
it just to put a
yeah,
few calories and a little bit of protein in afterwards. Then I'm fine.
yeah,
It's like how I feel in the evening is so much more intuitive now. I'm not like, I'm starving, I got to eat something. I'm starving, I got to eat something. It
yeah.
feels very different.
And when
It's
you're in that
honestly,
state of,
it's changed everything.
oh, I'm glad. Yeah, makes me very happy. Like this, it makes me happy hearing people like experience this because this is what I see and I know where people get it and they put it into practice. And it's not about perfection, but it's when you make these little changes that we can write off like it doesn't make a difference. Like honestly, it does make a difference,
Hmm.
but it's not always on the areas that people think it is.
Right.
And this is where I see those thoughts where so many people are like, okay, I'm trying to lose weight, or I'm trying to maintain my weight by creating this big energy deficit, not recognizing that physiologically that puts them in a state where they're constantly hungry, or that if they're a woman, that is compromising their hormones and their immune
Yeah.
system and putting them in a state of red. So even though I think a lot of times people are just looking at calories in, calories out, and it's a little bit more about like when is that energy coming in relation to your training. If there we want more around the training before, during, and after, and what you eat during training doesn't even come close to the size of what you're expending, so there's still a deficit there, but it puts you in that state where you can make smart food choices the rest of the day because you're not just fighting yourself to stop eating
Hmm.
all day long.
No, and I've experienced that in an incredible way over about the last 10 days. And then the other
Mm,
piece, it's a pretty simple piece of technology. I don't really wear a watch during the day, but I wear my Apple Watch
yeah,
every night. And it's a pretty simple algorithm, but obviously it's tracking my heart rate at full rest and heart rate variability and the quality of sleep I'm getting. And I don't think I've ever done a high intensity effort where the next day, like my numbers have always been awful. Like
yeah,
heart rate variability, much lower than baseline,
yeah,
very much too high of a resting heart rate. That's
yeah.
very high. And then the sleep quality is never good. Well,
Mm,
I was pleasantly surprised both when I got done with that high intensity effort. And all of us as cyclists know, and especially like when you're doing it on the indoor trainer and you're on Zwift, and you either it's a structured ride where you cross through like the invisible banner, and you know that effort's over, and you're literally slumped over the handlebars because you
Yeah.
don't have to pedal anymore. That's what that effort felt like.
Yeah.
And obviously my heart rate variability went down a little bit and my resting heart rate went up a little bit, but my sleep was good. So kind of the
Yeah.
algorithmic score that I got was the best I've ever had after
Yeah.
a long ride. And then I experienced the same thing this weekend. And granted, it's cold, so there wasn't the heat, but I ended up doing an outdoor metric because the weather here in the United States was on the East Coast was beautiful on
Mm.
Friday. But I fueled myself very
Yeah.
differently. I rode for about 3.5 hours. I consumed over 1,200 calories,
Yeah.
and it's the it's a long way from events. So it's the longest ride I've done really since the late summer, early fall. And again, I was not starving that night, and I've now have and I have a screenshot of it because I posted a smaller version of this on my social media. I'm going to do this again later in the week. I've got like this 9 day in a row window of like all really good readiness scores
Yeah.
because my resting heart rate's actually went down or stayed the same after that
Yeah.
63-mile event. And I know, again, I'm preaching to the choir, but I have found so much enthusiasm and buy-in
Yeah.
to this concept. And
Yeah.
it's like I could never do very much high intensity training. I'm not going to increase it by any sort of significant volume, but it's nice to
Mm.
wake up knowing that I could go again,
Oh,
especially at my age.
absolutely. And this is where like the intensity of your training is what dictates the fueling and the fueling source. So like you were talking before about with your ultra, your long distance events about like the
Mhm.
potato or the corn chips. And I think salty foods is something a lot of people don't tap into enough when it
Mhm.
comes to the ultra endurance or the really long
Right.
distance rides. Like the longer your ride is, I find the more options up your sleeve is useful to have. But you'll find
Mhm.
people, if they're only using drinks and they're only using gels, you get to the point of flavor fatigue where you don't want it.
Yeah.
And that's where the salty foods are great because you
Mhm.
can get a bit of carbohydrate, you can put some fats in there. But with those long events, it's the cumulative hours that puts you in
Mhm.
such a hole. And it can take 24, 48 hours plus to recover from some of these really intense or really long rides, which is why if you haven't fueled enough, that huge deficit is digging into you for the following days.
Right.
Whereas when you feel like you've been experiencing, you feel in that ride, there's still a deficit happening, but it allows you then to eat normally the rest of the day,
Yep.
sleep well, and then wake up with your body like, do you know what, like, okay, I'm a bit tired, but like I'm not like I'm exhausted, I've got to sleep all day, which allows for you to go back and train harder. And that's why I
Mhm.
say as well, with a lot of times people just focus on their race nutrition, like, well, you want to practice it in training so that
Right.
you know what works for you in a race. But also when you feel that training, you're going to get stronger, you're going to get faster, and you get better adaptation. So you get to that race
Right.
stronger than you would have if you just kept under feeling.
It's truly, and it's that taking into practice. I always had felt previously like, well, the only reason I need to practice this during training is to make sure that there's no stomach upset or anything like that. And yeah, that's certainly important, but I never connected the dots
Yeah.
to how this was going to positively impact performance. And I'm someone who typically rides probably about 5 days a week, just,
Yeah.
just with weather and circumstances and whatnot.
Yeah.
That metric I did was my 6th day in a row of
Mhm.
riding. And to be
Yeah.
able to have that kind of experience on that
Mm.
6th day in a row, which is not something I normally do, to enjoy it so much was just, it was a product of an entire 8, 9 day period of fueling my training properly. And
Mm.
again, it's been a game changer for me. It really has.
Yeah. No, I'm glad. Really glad to hear that. Do you have any words of wisdom for anyone that's kind of like on the fence, still in that, like, oh, I don't think this is going to work for me? Like, what thoughts or things would you say to someone to try and convince them to give it a shot and to try it?
That's a really good question. I think the biggest thing is I think it is such a Western culture mindset that has been built around creating that calorie deficit and having that sometimes it's obsessive. And again, it's true for people
Mm.
who do want to use exercise as a
Yeah.
means of, let's say, weight loss, or even in the situation like me, it's just weight maintenance, where it is a matter of understanding that the old antiquated way of looking at caloric intake
Mm.
isn't best practice anymore. And at
Mm.
least taking that leap to trust that that notion of, while you are exercising, what you're doing with fuel that's coming into your system is being dealt with so differently than at any other time. I've been doing this with at least a minimum of like 300 calories an hour minimum.
Yeah.
And then the high
Yeah.
intensity, I'm taking in 4. I mean, I almost hit 500 calories in my outdoor ride.
Yeah.
And I'm not someone who weighs myself. I just know how I feel
Yeah.
and how my body feels. And honestly, I feel great. And that was the
Yeah.
biggest hurdle for me, was, well, I don't want to take in all these calories, because then that's just going to be extra
Yeah.
calories. And I know what I eat in the morning and I know what I eat at night, and I'm going to gain weight. And if anything,
Yeah.
I've probably lost a little bit of weight through no intention of just
Mm.
the fact that I'm not hungry and I'm not a mindless eating machine anymore.
Mm.
And it's just, my metabolism is better. And I
Yeah.
don't understand the science of this piece of it. That would be something that you, as the expert, would have to speak about. It's not just that my appetite is more intuitive now. I'm getting better sleep. I'm not
Yeah.
as tired during the day. All those things are true now that simply weren't true before. So there has to have been a really good effect on my overall metabolism, because I've
Yeah.
been doing this for a good solid almost 2 weeks now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I haven't looked at your food diaries or anything,
Yeah.
but what I see in practice time and time again is that people are fixating just on the numbers. And like you, I find the primary reason people are hesitant and avoid fueling training is because they don't want to gain weight, or they
Yeah.
believe it's going to make them gain weight, or
Yeah.
they're using it as this. And I've talked about this in a previous podcast about how I'll see people, they're scared to stop exercising. They're scared to go on holidays and to stop because like, oh, but if I do that, I'm going to gain weight. Whereas what I see is that when we add the fueling into training, if the training stops for whatever reason, that extra fuel and food goes away. We have our baseline breakfast, lunch, dinner, what we
Mm-hmm.
need just for health and energy management. Yeah. Then we add on to training, which is why you should be eating. It could be anywhere from 1,800 to 5,000 calories, depending on what or more potentially. But the thing is that when all that fuel comes into exercise, if you're expending 500 and you're eating 300, there's a 200 calorie deficit. If you're eating 500 and you're expending 800, there's still a 300 calorie deficit per hour. But that deficit is then more manageable, and you can then carry it through the rest of the day. And when you don't have that raging Cookie Monster hunger, you can like the snack people. Also, people will come, oh, I need to stop snacking. I'm like, well, is it the problem or is it the outcome of what happened earlier in the day? And I would probably imagine, if I saw a food diary, you're probably eating the exact same amount of food in numbers as you were beforehand, but the distribution with it. So maybe there was the 500 calories now in training used to be in snacks or extra food, just nibbling throughout the day. But when it's done intuitively and it's being used differently because it's being used in exercise, then your body utilizes it different. And that's how your body composition starts to shift without you even having to be trying to lose. It just starts to metabolize everything a lot more intuitively.
No, and I can't speak for any sort of extended or week-long holiday, but I rode on Friday. It was 6 days in a row. So I purposely gave myself the weekend off of riding. I did not ride Saturday or Sunday. I happened to be away from home in Philadelphia for 2 days, and, staying in a hotel, and, didn't have a whole lot of kind of like an agenda, or like my time wasn't very structured. So I think in the past, a lot of that time might have been filled with, too much caloric intake. But
Yeah.
I can tell you anecdotally from the last 2 days that that was absolutely not the case in a way
Mm.
that has never been the case before. So again,
Yeah.
I can't be a spokesperson for the whole week of holiday, but I
Yeah.
had 2 days of unstructured time, and it was very different than what days off felt like in the past when
Mm.
I had been chronically under fueling my training. I mean, you think about it,
Yeah.
how many times do we actually race? We
Yeah.
don't, think about the number of days, even if someone's doing, like a lot of short distance stuff, or they're having a crit season or whatever. The number of days spent training far outstrips the number of days they're actually competing. And,
Mm.
for someone who's doing endurance and ultra endurance events, it outstrips it even more. Like I'll compete maximum twice a year. And,
Mm.
some people doing ultra marathons will compete maybe 3 or 4 times a year. So those days spent training, and then you add in, adaptation days, or recovery days, those number of days far outstrips anything. And I can look
Yeah.
back at the last 2 days, and because I've experienced in the past, I've had a 5 day block of really good training, and I'm
Cooked.
ravenous for 2 days. And it's probably been
Yeah.
yo-yoing my metabolism without even realizing it,
Mm.
where those 2 days were very different. I just didn't feel, I wasn't constantly thinking about food
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I can speak to experience for folks that might be afraid of that at least a end sample of one for a couple days off the bike. It's
Yeah.
actually better to be fueling your rides.
Yeah. No, exactly. And this is why, like, I think writing it down, making notes for yourself, because like I can tell you what to do, but it's got to come from within. And I mean,
Right.
it's probably 6 months ago that you think you took my course, probably, or maybe
Yeah.
a little bit longer. But even with you, when you know you could or should be, and you sort of dabble in it, it can take a long time to actually
Yeah.
put it into practice. But when you feel the big improvements and performance improvements on the bike, but also I like talking a lot about performance off the bike, because
Hmm.
we all have lives. We don't live
Yeah.
insular situations. And if you finish your ride, you finish your event, you finish your training, and you've got energy to be present with your family, energy
Yeah.
to go for a walk with them versus spend the day on the couch because you're like, oh, I've got no energy, I can't be here with you, then your quality of life is improved. You're at work, you've got more energy to go
Yeah.
at work. And that's why fueling in training is so valuable, because it's not only helping your cycling performance, but it's helping your health, your energy levels, your appetite. And when you put it into practice, you can see and feel the benefit. And it's just getting over that mindset piece
It
and the
is.
barrier mentally.
Yeah. It really is getting over that barrier and taking that leap to
Yeah.
undo the messages that we've all gotten in society, honestly, for decades at this
Yeah.
point. And,
Yeah.
certainly while, social media is so wonderful, I might not have ever been introduced to you if it wasn't
Yeah.
for social media. So it has such a valuable place in society, but the little trapdoor of that are
Yeah.
these like non-fact based messages that get
Yeah.
repeated over and over again that keep people having that barrier until, for whatever reason, like me, they're willing to just be like, all right, this is a high intensity session, I'm doing 400, at least 400 calories an hour with this.
Yeah.
And that's when the magic happens.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I couldn't have said it better myself. So no, I'm really glad to hear how much a difference it's made for you. And I think you talked earlier about how often it's the boring basics that we don't do a good job of marketing it. And I know if I gave really extreme advice in one end or the other, then a lot of people would be more attracted to that, because we
Mm-hmm.
want the quick fix. We want
Yeah.
we want to take the pill. We want to do it once and da-da, it's all fixed. But unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. And it's the putting it into practice and building it up makes it sustainable. And yeah, certainly, I think a lot of people overlook just how much of an impact these little changes can make on how you feel and how you perform. So it's getting over your thoughts of it's not going to work, it's too easy, but
Mm-hmm.
actually you want it to be easy. When it's easy
Right.
to do physically, it's getting over the hardness of the mindset of it.
Right.
When it's something that's physically easy to do, you're more likely to keep doing it for the next 5, 10, 20 years that you stay as a cyclist.
No, and I made me realize it's like what you're so appropriately and passionately preaching, and in my lane, what I'm passionately and science-based preaching, it's apples and oranges, but they are, or even, no, I don't even think that's the right analogy. I think they're both apples. They're just different types of apples. They're very similar in
Yeah.
that it's the repetitiveness of that simple thing that's
Yeah.
really going to make such a
Yeah.
critical difference. I mean, a lot of people talk about when it comes to that, developing slow twitch fibers in mitochondria, train slow to race fast.
Yeah.
And it's how do you have that same leap of faith with something like that,
Mm.
where when you add that component to it, it's very similar in that it's counterintuitive, that it's going to make you faster in the long run because you're clearing lactic acid.
Yeah.
It's eat more while you're training to both perform better and manage your weight, whether it's, weight maintenance or weight
Yeah.
loss, because it seems so counterintuitive.
I think that's, you've hit the nail on the head. It sounds counterintuitive to be
Mm-hmm.
eating more, but when you eat more at the right time, it allows you to eat less when you don't need it. But
Yep.
it's not even, you're not even conscious of it,
Yep.
because when, like, if you're expending 1500, 500, 1500 calories in exercise, like that's a deficit. That is why you have that recovery and that exhaustion the next day, because it could be an entire day's worth of energy being expended. And
Yep.
a lot of times people think that, oh, that's a good thing, I'm going to lose more weight, but don't recognize that when you're in that state of extreme hunger, you're more likely to be snacking and overindulge or eat more at times when you're not exercising,
Mm-hmm.
which is why we can end up storing some additional body fat, or weight stays exactly the same, even though in theory you're like, I should be losing weight, I'm doing all this exercise, which reinforces that I've got to keep exercising
Yep.
fear.
Yep.
Whereas when you add the fuel into training, there's still a deficit, but it just calms everything down. You can intuitively eat. That's why
Mm-hmm.
it is a game changer. So
Yep.
yeah, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience about how it's impacted you and the challenges you've experienced getting here. But I think it's a really important message that I think a lot of people will find useful to help them, encourage them to give it a try as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Again, I can look back at my own journey and hope that it helps people that I come across, and
Yeah.
some of the stories I've shared will help folks that will hopefully choose to work with you as an expert in this field, because that, it's an overused term, game changer, but in this case it's not. It really is a game changer. It truly is. And
Yeah.
I'm very excited, and I'm going to continue in my own journey to keep beating the drum and sharing examples and stuff that has helped me along this journey, because
Mm.
I'm a convert now. I'm bought in.
Oh, amazing. Well, thanks for joining me today. And yeah, I really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.